On the eve of his hanging, when the jailhouse lamp burned low and the gallows outside creaked like an old man clearing his throat, Calder Voss sat alone on a narrow cot and listened to the wind as if it had come to speak only to him, and in that lonely hour he began to confess, not to a priest, for none had come, nor to a judge, for judgment had already been passed, but to the quiet itself, to the dust and the rope and the years that had followed him like shadows, and he spoke softly at first, telling the darkness that the stories told about him were easier than the truth, that legends were cleaner than memories, and that every blood-soaked tale whispered in saloons had left out the part where a man once loved the smell of rain on open grass and the sound of a woman laughing without fear. He said he had been called a butcher, a devil, a curse riding on horseback, yet no one had ever asked how a boy named Calder learned to flinch at raised voices, or why he slept with one hand open, like he might drop something precious if he closed it. And as the wind slid through the bars he admitted that the first gun he ever held had not felt like power but like a promise he did not want to keep, because it came on the day he buried his younger brother beneath a cottonwood tree, the earth too dry to hold tears, the grave too shallow to hide regret, and from that day on the world seemed to demand payment in hard choices, each one louder than the last. He told the night how he had ridden with men who laughed at cruelty because laughter made it easier, how he had fired when firing was expected and turned away when mercy would have marked him weak, and how each wrong step built the road that ended here beneath a beam of rough wood smelling of sap and finality. Yet there was a secret the stories never carried, a truth folded small and kept close like a worn photograph, and it lived in the memory of Elena Marrow, a schoolteacher with ink-stained fingers and eyes that saw through his borrowed name the first time he walked into her classroom to fix a broken shutter, a woman who spoke to him like he was still becoming rather than already lost, whose voice softened the hard places inside him, and as Calder confessed he said that loving her had been the most dangerous thing he ever did, because it taught him what he could lose, because it made every job feel heavier and every lie taste bitter, and because on the night the town burned, not by his hand, though the blame would later settle on his shoulders like ash, he chose to pull children from smoke instead of riding away with the others, and in that choice the legend cracked, though no one saw it. He told the wind how Elena had held his face afterward, soot on her cheek, fear in her breath, and asked him to leave before the world finished deciding what he was, and he had promised he would, but promises in the West were thin as paper when faced with men who knew your trail, and so he stayed one night too many, long enough for the law to arrive with questions sharpened into accusations, long enough for lies to settle where truth should have stood, and now, waiting for dawn, Calder admitted that he had carried the blame because it kept others safe, because some truths needed time to breathe and time was the one thing he no longer had. He confessed that he had killed, yes, but never for pleasure, never without remembering faces afterward, never without wishing the world offered another way, and he wondered aloud if the rope would feel lighter knowing that the worst thing he had done was believe he could outrun his past, and as the lamp flickered he spoke Elena's name once more, not as a plea but as a thank you, because loving her had made the darkness honest, and if this was to be his last night, he wanted the wind to know that the legend was wrong in the quietest, truest way, that beneath the outlaw's blooded trail there had been a man who tried to choose differently when it mattered, and as the gallows whispered outside, Calder Voss finished his confession with a steady breath, sitting straighter than he had all evening, as if the telling itself had lifted some weight, and in the hush before sleep he listened for footsteps that did not come, unaware that dawn would bring not only the rope but consequences no one had yet imagined. They said her name in red mesa only when they were sure the wind would carry it away, spoken low and careful like a warning rather than a memory, because Isadora Vale had buried 3 men beneath the desert sun and every one of them had been an outlaw who loved her deeply and died violently, and whether that made her cursed or simply unlucky depended on who was telling the story. But when she arrived in town riding a black horse with a black veil pinned neatly at her throat, the air itself seemed to tighten as if the land remembered her before the people did, and she took the small adobe house at the edge of town where the red stone rose sharp and unforgiving behind it, a place no one wanted and no one questioned, and she lived quietly there, tending a small garden that struggled against the heat, speaking little, eyes always steady, grief worn not loudly but carefully like a well-kept scar. Men watched her from a distance, some with hunger, some with fear, because beauty clung to her in a way sorrow could not dull, but none dared cross the line between curiosity and fate, for Red Mesa was a town built on superstition as much as dust, and stories traveled faster than truth, yet Isadora paid no mind, for she had learned long ago that surviving love left little room for caring what strangers believed, and each night she lit a lamp and sat alone, listening to the desert hum, thinking of promises once made under stars that had not kept them. It was on one such night, when the heat still clung heavy even after sunset, that a sound broke the quiet, a thud at her door, followed by a breath dragged sharp with pain, and when she opened it she found a man collapsed in the dirt, blood dark against his shirt, dust caked into his hair. Eyes fluttering between consciousness and surrender, and she did not scream or hesitate, because danger was something she recognized the way others recognized weather, so she dragged him inside with strength born of necessity, laid him on her table, and worked by lamplight to clean the wound near his ribs, her hands steady though her heart knew better than to believe this moment harmless. His name, she learned later, was Rowan Pike, a gunslinger chased by men who wanted him dead for reasons he had not yet spoken, and as Isadora stitched his wound and cooled his fever through the long night, memories rose unbidden, another man bleeding, another promise whispered, another dawn that ended with a grave, and she told herself this time would be different because she would keep her distance, because she would not let him stay, because she would not let her heart remember how to open. Yet when Rowan woke days later, weak and confused, his first sight was her face calm and unreadable, and his first words were not of fear or desire but gratitude spoken simply, honestly, and something in that cracked the wall she had built. He stayed because he could not ride, and she allowed it because she told herself kindness did not mean fate, and slowly, carefully, a quiet life formed between them, built on shared silence and small acts, on meals eaten without hurry, on the way Rowan watched her as if she were something rare and breakable, not cursed, not dangerous, and in those days Isadora felt the old ache return, the longing she had buried under soil and stone, the hope that whispered maybe the desert did not only take but sometimes gave. Yet Red Mesa watched, and men talked, and fear curled through the town like smoke, because the widow of Red Mesa loving again felt like tempting the gallows itself, and Rowan began to hear the stories too, half-spoken warnings that followed him when he limped through town, tales of dead lovers and violent ends, and though he laughed them off at first, the seed was planted, watered by the sound of distant riders and the way Isadora sometimes flinched at hoofbeats in the night. When he finally asked her, not accusing but careful, she did not deny it, and in the lamplight she told him of Jonah Black, Silas Crane, Matthew Holt, men she had loved not for their guns but for who they were when the world was quiet, and how the West had taken them one by one, leaving her with rings she no longer wore and grief she carried without complaint. And Rowan listened, truly listened, and said something she had never heard before, that perhaps the danger was not her love but the lives men like him chose to live, and in that moment she wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the warmth growing between them. But fate did not wait for permission, and one morning dust rose on the horizon in a way that meant trouble, men riding hard with purpose, and Rowan knew them before they reached town, men from his past drawn by rumor and blood, and as he reached for his gun, still weak, Isadora felt the familiar cold settle in her chest. The understanding that loving him might cost him everything, and she asked him to leave before nightfall, voice steady though her hands trembled, because she had learned that survival sometimes meant choosing loss early. But Rowan looked at her with something fierce and gentle all at once and said he was tired of running, tired of letting fear decide his ending, and as the sun burned high over Red Mesa, the widow and the gunslinger stood at the edge of a choice neither could fully see, love pulling one way, history pulling another, and the desert holding its breath as if waiting to claim what it was owed. Deadwood Crossing had forgotten what law looked like long before Silas Mercer rode in on a limping horse with dust on his coat and a tarnished badge hidden beneath it. Town built crooked from neglect where windows stayed shuttered not for weather but for fear, where men settled arguments with fists or guns and buried the results behind the church without sermons. And when Silas passed beneath the leaning welcome sign, no one greeted him because no one believed in arrivals anymore. Yet he felt the weight of the place settle into his bones the way old wounds remembered rain, for this was not the first broken town he had seen and not the first time he had come carrying something he never wanted to wear again. Years earlier, in another place now spoken of only in low tones, Silas had been a marshal who believed rules could hold men together, who believed showing up was enough, and that belief had cost him his wife, Lydia, caught between bullets meant for others on a day Silas chose patience over speed, mercy over finality, and the West had taught him its lesson with blood, leaving him with a badge that felt heavier than any gun and a promise to himself never to wear it again. Yet here he was, because running only worked until the road curved back on itself, and Deadwood Crossing needed something it did not know how to ask for. The men who ran the town watched him from doorways, led by Harlan Pike, a rancher turned tyrant who smiled too easily and spoke like he owned the dust, and when Silas paid for a room and said little, they assumed he would pass through like all the others. but the children watched him differently, curious at the way he fixed a loose board outside the jail without being asked, at how he stepped between a drunk and a woman with quiet authority, at how trouble seemed to hesitate when he was near. And slowly, against reason, the town began to lean toward him. Silas took the job no one else wanted, reopening the jail that smelled of rot and regret, cleaning it out with his own hands, finding the old desk where the last marshal had left a bullet hole and no name. And when someone laughed at the idea of law returning, Silas did not argue, because he knew law was not a speech but a stand. And every night as he lay awake listening to the wind scrape along the streets, Lydia's face came back to him, asking the same question. It always did. What would you do differently this time? And he did not yet have an answer. The turning point came when Harlan Pike's men beat a shopkeeper for refusing to give credit, leaving him bleeding in the street while the town watched in silence, and Silas stepped forward then, badge visible at last, voice calm but carrying, saying simply that it would not happen again, and laughter followed, loud and sharp, because Deadwood Crossing had buried its faith too deep to dig up easily. But Silas stood his ground, and that night a warning shot shattered his window, reminding him how thin courage could feel when it stood alone. The days that followed drew lines in dust and blood, as Silas jailed a man for the first time in years, faced down threats he had learned too well to ignore, and trained a handful of townsfolk not to be fighters but witnesses, teaching them that law only lived if people chose to see it. Yet the ghosts did not stay quiet, and when Harlan Pike forced a confrontation, taunting Silas with Lydia's name after learning who he was, the past came roaring back, the memory of hesitation, the sound of a shot he had not fired in time, and for a moment Silas felt himself fracture, wondering if this town would end the same way as the last, if the badge demanded payment he could no longer afford. The night before the expected fight, Deadwood Crossing sat tense and breathless, lanterns glowing like fragile hopes, and Silas walked the empty street alone, stopping at the church where Lydia would have stood had she lived, admitting aloud that he was afraid not of dying but of failing again, and in that confession something settled, not courage exactly but clarity, the understanding that wearing the badge did not mean saving everyone, only doing what needed to be done when it mattered. Dawn came hard and bright, and with it Harlan Pike and his men, guns ready, confidence loud, and the town watched from behind doors as Silas stepped out to meet them, posture straight, eyes steady, not as the man he had been but as the one he had become. And when the shooting started it was fast and brutal and final, dust kicked up, glass shattered, fear screamed, but Silas did not hesitate this time, did not wait for the world to choose for him, and when it was over, Harlan Pike lay in the dirt staring at a sky he no longer owned, his men scattered, their power broken not just by bullets but by resistance, by a town that finally stepped forward. Silas stood alone again afterward, wounded but breathing, the badge heavy against his chest, and as the people of Deadwood Crossing emerged into the light, something like belief passed between them, fragile but real, and Silas knew he would stay, not because the ghosts were gone, but because facing them had finally taught him that law was not about preventing loss, it was about refusing to let loss be the end of the story. And as the wind moved through the crossing, it carried Lydia's name softly this time, not as an accusation, but as a reminder of why he had chosen to stand at all long before anyone living could remember. Black Canyon had been a place the sun touched carefully, as if even the light feared what slept beneath its walls, and the elders said the devil himself had split the rock there, hiding a vein of gold so rich it could rot a man's soul before it filled his pockets, a story most folks laughed at until desperation made them listen, and it was desperation that led Elias Crowder to the map, found folded inside a dead prospector's coat at the back of a shuttered trading post. The paper brittle, the ink faded, but the markings clear enough to promise an end to hunger, an end to debt, an end to the long shame of coming up empty-handed in a world that rewarded only the ruthless. Elias was not a cruel man, only a tired one, worn thin by years of digging for other men's fortunes, by nights sleeping under stars that felt colder each season, and when he studied the map by firelight, he told himself he did not believe the stories, that gold was only rock and luck. Yet as soon as he set out toward Black Canyon, something followed him, not a rider or a beast, but a sound like breath brushing his ear, a whisper that knew his name though he had not spoken it aloud, promising relief, promising rest, promising that everything he had lost could be returned if he only kept walking. The desert stretched wide and unforgiving, heat pressing down until thoughts blurred, and with each mile the whispers grew clearer, no longer just sounds but words shaped like memory, reminding him of his wife Naomi, buried 3 winters past, of the child they never had, of the house that slipped from his hands when grief made him careless, and Elias told himself it was thirst, exhaustion, guilt, anything but the canyon calling. Yet when he reached the blackened stone walls rising like a wound in the earth, his heart beat not with fear but with recognition, as if some part of him had been waiting all along. Inside the canyon, the air cooled strangely, shadows clung too long, and the gold revealed itself not buried deep but glinting openly in a scene that pulsed faintly like a living thing, and as Elias touched it, the whispers became voices, many now, layered and intimate, telling him he was chosen, telling him the others had failed because they were greedy, because they wanted too much too fast, but that he was different, that he only wanted enough to rest, enough to stop running, and the price, they said, would be small, a memory here, a name there, things he barely needed anymore. Days passed in a haze as Elias worked, filling his bags with gold heavier than any he had known, yet each night the voices took something, first the sound of Naomi's laughter, then the exact shade of her eyes, then the feeling of her hand in his, and when he tried to leave the canyon, the path twisted, leading him back to the vein no matter which direction he chose, until he realized with rising terror that the map had never shown an exit, only a way in. Weakened and frightened, Elias began to understand the truth the legends hid behind superstition, that the curse was not fire or demons but choice, the slow trade of humanity for comfort, and when he screamed into the canyon that he wanted to go home, the voices answered gently that this was home now, that the gold would keep him company when memory was gone, and in that moment Elias saw others standing in the shadows, prospectors long dead yet not at rest, eyes empty, hands still digging, bound not by chains but by the bargain they had accepted. With what strength he had left, Elias dropped his bags, letting the gold spill into the dust, and the canyon screamed then, a sound like stone breaking apart, as if angered by refusal, and the voices turned sharp, reminding him of his failures, his loneliness, his fear of dying forgotten. But Elias clutched the one thing they had not yet taken, the pain of loss, and used it as an anchor, whispering Naomi's name over and over even as it began to fade, choosing grief over comfort, emptiness over damnation. And somehow the path straightened, the shadows loosening their grip just enough for him to stumble free at dawn, collapsing miles from the canyon with empty hands and a hollow chest, alive but changed. When he reached the nearest town days later, he told his story to anyone who would listen, but people only heard what they wanted, some scoffing, others leaning in too close, and Elias knew then that Black Canyon would never truly be hidden, that maps could burn and men could warn, but desperation always redrew the trail, and though he lived the rest of his days poor and quiet, sometimes waking with tears he could not explain, he never went back, because he understood at last that the devil's gold did not buy souls outright, it simply asked men what they were willing to live without, and the canyon waited patiently, knowing the answer would always come walking under the desert sun.